continue on. Okay. All right, bear with me. We've been having some Blackboard glitches with the sharing application today. Alright, so I think this was where we had got to. We'd started talking about the lactate threshold. Recall that in applied scenarios, we often use VO2 max as the measure of aerobic capacity that an individual has, so how good they are at aerobic work. So people who are long distance runners, or even just, not athletes, but people who are good at hiking for a long time, or biking, or even, if they're runners, then those people typically have higher VO2 maxes than someone who's very, very good at anaerobic work, so a jumper or a sprinter, okay? So that VO2 max is a way of us to judge someone's capability for aerobic work. An even better way is to use lactate threshold. Let me draw a picture here. So what happens with VO2? VO2 is has a very strong genetic component. And so what we get with VO2, so here's VO2. And here is time or training. And what we see is that VO2 will improve quite steadily, and then it plateaus. Right? So if I take someone who is untrained or sedentary or low active, then this improvement can take anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks. And then we'll get this plateau. And for highly trained athletes, that plateau has a little window either side, sort of like this. So, if I push really hard with training, I can improve it minimally. Okay? And so we get this plateau. And so the question then is, well, if I'm training for longer than 3 months, and my VO2 max has plateaued, then how come I'm still improving? All right, and that's where understanding lactate threshold comes in. Okay. So on this diagram, we can see that for an untrained person, so low active, not an aerobic person, all right, that their lactate threshold on average, right, these are all average numbers, so you're going to have some variability in there, is around 45 to 50% of their VO2 max. All right, so this is at 50, this corner. And so they're working, the intensity's increasing, they're working, and at 50%, their blood lactate levels go up very rapidly. Okay? So the corner, the lactate threshold, is said to represent the point at which that individual transitions from working aerobically, predominantly aerobically, to working predominantly anaerobically using glycolysis, because that's when we get lactate, right? If you remember our glycolytic chain, at the bottom we end up with pyruvate. The pyruvate picks up hydrogen, turns into lactate, gets dumped into the bloodstream. Okay? So the only way we can see an increase in blood lactate levels is if we're working using glycolysis. All right? So there's lots of really interesting ideas around this lactate threshold, right? Because it also represents the point at which I'm heading towards physiological fatigue. Because if I'm working anaerobically, sooner or later my hydrogen ions are going to build up to a point where glycolysis slows down and I'm dead in the water, right? So this anaerobic portion of the curve is heading towards physiological fatigue. All right? So what happens when we do a lot of aerobic training, once we've reached that plateau in our VO2 max, the improvements that we continue to see are because what happens with endurance training is we shift that lactate threshold to the right. Okay? So that means that I can work at higher and higher intensities before I start to fatigue because I've switched over to glycolysis. Does that make sense? A little bit. So you can see here this trained person, their lactate threshold is around 70 or so, right? And the more training they do, the further that threshold gets pushed to the right, the longer they can go, the faster they can go before they start to fatigue. And that's where the continued improvement with training comes from once you've got your VO2 max at its peak, right? So, if I'm doing aerobic work consistently, what adaptations am I going to see? We talked about the adaptations that we saw in the two anaerobic systems. Remember, adaptations are typically positive. So you're going to stress your body in a particular way, and your body is going to respond by adapting so that you are better at the thing you were stressing it with. Okay? So, as with our anaerobic systems, we see an increase in aerobic enzyme amount and activity. So that can be anywhere from 40 to 90% according to the literature. So it can be quite dramatic increase. Okay, and sometimes that's because if we're working aerobically, we said that aerobic metabolism occurs in the mitochondria, and so what you find in muscle tissue that is very aerobic and is trained aerobically, we get more mitochondria within that muscle tissue. And more mitochondria means there's more enzyme availability. Okay? If we're doing sprint type work for more than 10 seconds, so if we're doing sprint bouts that are longer than 10 seconds, there's some disagreement in the literature about whether or not we see increase amounts of aerobic enzymes and mitochondria, but there isn't any question that we see it with aerobic training, right? Again, if I'm going to be breaking down substrates to make ATP to fuel this work, then having more substrate available would increase ATP production and therefore be a positive adaptation. Okay, and that's exactly what we see. We see increases in intramuscular, that means inside the muscle, glycogen stores, and also increased in intramuscular triglyceride stores. Right? So we lay down more fat in the muscle tissue and more carbohydrate in the muscle tissue so that it's immediately there for use for aerobic metabolism. Okay, so let me see. If I do not replenish my glycogen stores, right? So if I train and I use up my stored glycogen in that training session, and then I don't eat enough carbohydrate that evening to replenish overnight those stores, then the next day's training session is going to be very hard work. Is it not? Okay, this is the problem we've been having. Let me go back to there. Okay, I don't know why this is happening today. We've not had this trouble all semester so far. All right, let me go back here. I'm going to have to keep this on small size because when I open it up to the slideshow, for some reason today it's decided not to work. Where am I? Yes, so if I'm not replenishing these glycogen stores on a daily basis, right? It's not like our fat stores where we've got thousands of calories stored, right? Our glycogen stores are relatively small, and so we have to keep replenishing them. So if we don't replenish them, then the following day's training is going to be very hard work. I'm going to feel fatigued. My legs are going to feel heavy, something like that. All right, and I won't necessarily be able to maintain my training pace that I want. Right. So we also see not just increased availability of glycogen and triglyceride, but we see improved use of that substrate. So it is metabolized faster to get at the ATP more quickly. So not as fast as anaerobic work, but faster than before I started training aerobically, right? So that again is linked to the fact that we've got more mitochondrial enzymes, and some other adaptations that we'll talk about in the next couple of chapters. We have increased capillary numbers and improved oxygen transport and other things that link to being able to metabolize carbs and fats more quickly. All right? And then at any given intensity, submax, right, we are going to start to rely more on fats and less on carbs compared to someone who does not train aerobically. All right, so that's got lots of benefits for it. Right, remember that our fats have a lot more calories, a lot more energy available. So the sooner I can access them, the better off I am. Right, so that's a benefit. Then also, the more I use my fat stores and the less I use my carbohydrate stores, the more carbohydrate I have for the end of the race when I want to be able to sprint to beat my PB, right? Or beat the person next to me, okay? So that's really beneficial because if I've used up all my carbs when I go to sprint, that ain't happening. right? Because I can't sprint using fat. I can only sprint using carbohydrate, right? Okay. So, there's lots of benefits to these adaptations. I can increase the duration that I want to run for at the same pace. All right? So I might say, all right, I've been running for 20 minutes, now I want to run for 25 minutes. But I'm not going to increase the intensity, I'm just going to go for longer. Okay? So that can be a good goal if my goal is fat loss, right? But it might not be the goal if I'm competing. The goal might be that I want to be able to increase my pace without fatiguing, right? So I want to shift that lactate threshold across so I can run a little bit faster. I can run at a higher intensity without having to use anaerobic work. Okay, so then we see lactate threshold occurring at higher intensities with more and more training, which lets me, which means that I can maintain a higher intensity at predominantly aerobic work, so I'm not producing hydrogen ions and I don't end up with physiological fatigue. And because we've already said we're going to start using fats a little bit earlier, so remember our crossover, right? The average kind of time for people to switch from using carbs to fats is about 20 minutes. So for someone who is an endurance athlete, they're going to switch a little bit before that 20 minutes. Their body is going to adapt to get at that fat as quickly as it can, so a little bit sooner. Not straight away. It's not like you start running and you're immediately using your fat stores. Okay, you've still got a period of time to get to the point where you can break down those big molecules. But it edges earlier, right? So there's many different physiological adaptations that can come into play when I'm training aerobically on a regular basis, quite apart from the fact of the health adaptations that you get with doing aerobic work. All right, and this is one of the reasons why I set the physical activity portfolio to look at your aerobic work, because ultimately, when you are not an athlete, it's your aerobic work that will keep your heart healthy and your vascular system healthy, right? The anaerobic work will keep you strong, help you maintain your balance, look good, your muscles will be tight, but it doesn't do enough here, okay? So that's why I want you to start thinking about, well, what really is aerobic work? How can I incorporate it into my daily life? Right? All right. Any questions on lactate threshold or adaptations? Okay. All right. So we have one more kind of concept to really cover in this chapter, and that's the idea of what's happening during recovery. Right? So when we exercise, lots of things get thrown out of whack in our body. all right? Our temperature goes up, we get flooded with all these additional hormones, and we get stress hormones because exercise is a stressor, even though it's typically considered a healthy stressor up to a point, right? But we still have the same physiological reaction. So our heart rate raises, our breathing rate raises, our temperature raises, we've got all these hormones flooding around, right? We've diverted blood from our stomach to all these other muscles, and we have to get that back into homeostasis, into a resting position, all right? So the recovery is very important. And we have a, I don't know what you call it, a principle, I suppose, that we call EPOC. And EPOC stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. EPOC is a lot easier, right? It's a bit like the NAD. If it helps you to know that NAD is nicotinamide dinucleotide or whatever it is, great. Otherwise, NAD, right? Same with EPOC, okay? Excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So it's exactly what the name says, all right? That when we finish any kind of physical activity and we are sitting down or we're stationary or we switch to a very low intensity type of movement, we still breathe very heavily, even though we've switched to an intensity level that I don't need that much oxygen available for. Right? So why is that happening? What's the purpose of it? Okay? So that's what we want to understand here. Okay? So this is one of the things that has changed quite a bit since I was an undergrad, and I recognize that was a very long time ago now, but it's why you want to keep up with the research when you graduate. If you're going to be in this area, you can't rely on the knowledge that you got now, because exercise physiology and what we understand about our bodies is changing all the time, all right? So this is one of them. So when you look at this graph, you can see that on the y-axis is oxygen consumption, on the x-axis is time. And the lower dotted line down here, right? The lower dotted line represents how much oxygen I have to consume at rest. So when I'm sitting down or lying down, right? And then we start moving. And immediately our need for oxygen changes, right? Because ideally we would go from rest straight into aerobic metabolism, because I can make a lot more ATP there. But we know that physiologically that is not what happens, all right? So the dotted line up here is the oxygen level that I need to consume to do the work that I'm doing. But we have this anaerobic phase, all right? I've got to get to my aerobic metabolism first of all right? So here's my resting oxygen. Here's the oxygen I really need, but I don't have available yet, so I have an anaerobic portion of work. So this dark shaded area here is called the oxygen deficit. So the oxygen deficit is the difference between the amount of oxygen we're actually consuming, right, because we're building up as we're working through the anaerobic portion, and what we needed if we were working immediately aerobically, right? So oxygen deficit is an indirect measure of the anaerobic portion of work that I do. Right? So here's my anaerobic work, anaerobic, 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 and here I'm about my 3 minutes, and I'm working aerobically now for however long I need to. All right? And this line here, if it stays constant, means that I'm working at steady state. So if I get onto the treadmill in the max pack and I set the treadmill at 6 or 7 miles an hour, right? I start off with my jogging. I'm going to work anaerobically for about 3 minutes, and around 3 minutes or so we switch to predominantly aerobic metabolism. So next time you're out to do something aerobic, think about, can I identify the point at which it becomes easier, right? So the first 3 to 5 minutes of work is kind of uncomfortable, a little bit difficult, feels like I'm having to breathe really hard, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, I'm just kind of bopping along now, right? I'm in my stride, I can just keep this up, I can just keep going, right? That's steady state. Now if I hit a hill, then I have to increase intensity to get up the hill. I'm going to have to increase my oxygen consumption, if I can, right, to get up the hill. But as long as I'm running on my treadmill and I don't add the incline, then I can just keep going in my steady state. It means that I am breathing in enough oxygen to meet the demands of the work that I am doing at the muscular level for ATP. If I demand more ATP, because I add an incline, then I have to get more oxygen into the system. Right? But steady state means everything's chugging along. Right? I've got enough of everything I need to just keep going at this level. So I'm chugging along on the treadmill at my 6 or 7 miles an hour, and I've done my time, and I slow the treadmill down to a walk, and I walk for a few minutes, and then I stop. What am I still doing though? Right? When you train, when you stop, what are you still doing?
Recovering?
Yeah, but, okay, be more specific, right? So I'm running, and I'm breathing, and I'm at a level, and when I stop running, do I stop breathing so hard?
No.
No, right? Well, that's a bit weird, because when I stop running, my oxygen requirement comes back down here. So how come I'm still doing all this, right? What's happening there? Because I don't need that much oxygen anymore. Because now I'm standing still, stretching out.
Are you still like returning your oxygen level back to normal until you reach that regular state?
Say that again for me.
Aren't you reaching, like, you're returning to your body the oxygen level and all of your organs and in your blood back to a normal state?
Yes, absolutely. And that takes energy. And we provide energy by working aerobically, right? So even though I'm not actually doing a lot of aerobic work anymore, all the stuff that I have to put back to rest takes energy. And that's why we have this excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Right? So, now, this then gets really interesting. When I was your age and saw, this second dark area of the curve here was called the oxygen debt, and it exactly mirrored the oxygen deficit. So when I was an undergrad, we thought that the oxygen debt was just replacing the original oxygen deficit. Right? That's not the case. We know more now. And if you look at the shaded area on the right-hand side of the graph, you'll see it's much larger than the initial oxygen deficit. So one of the things I would say to you is that if you are looking online or you're reading an older textbook or something, and they call this part of the graph the oxygen debt, you need to double check the date and the validity of the work. Because in my opinion, if they're calling it the oxygen debt, it's possible they're out of date, right? Because now we call it epoch, because it's so much bigger than the deficit was. Okay? So, what's going on during epoch then? Okay? So the first couple of minutes here, where we see the curve drop very steeply, all right? That's about 2 to 3 minutes for most people. And that's called the rapid phase, because it's very steep, right? It's not rocket science. And during that 2 to 3 minutes, the additional ATP that we're making is being used to resynthesize phosphocreatine in the muscle cells, right? Because somewhere over here, at the beginning, we broke down all our ATP and phosphocreatine to get going on our treadmill run, right? So at the end of the run, we've got to resynthesize those so they're ready for the next thing, right? Then the next phase, much less steep, called the slow phase, right, is where we think that there's several different things going on. It can last, and how long this phase lasts will depend upon how big the deficit was, the intensity of the work that you were doing, how long you kept it going for, right? The duration drives the length of the slow phase, okay? So intensity is more important than duration, so how hard I'm working is a bigger factor than how long I'm working, but how long I'm working does play a role, okay? So here we have aerobic metabolism of the lactate that was made, so any blood lactate or lactate that is still in the muscle cells has to be metabolized, it's got to be shifted out, and use the Cori cycle to turn it into something usable. So about 70% of the lactate gets metabolized aerobically, 20% is used to synthesize glucose, and a little bit is used to synthesize some amino acids. Okay? We have to restore blood and muscle oxygen levels. So at no time do I have no oxygen in the system, all right? There's always some oxygen in my bloodstream, not very much if I'm at rest, but enough to keep me ticking over, right? There's always a little bit of oxygen sitting in the muscle cell, not very much, and certainly not enough to work aerobically if I'm going for a run. Right? I have to supplement it by breathing harder. Okay? And we've got to do something with all those elevated hormones. We've got to bring the body temperature back down. We've got to slow the heart rate. We've got to slow the breathing rate. And all of that takes energy. So that's all happening during this epoch phase, during the recovery phase, right? So, here's what's interesting to me, okay? Because when I was your age, I was not very smart. I was a little bit slow on the uptake, occasionally, most of the time, actually. And so I never could understand, even though we did this at school, right? I remember doing this graph as an undergrad. I didn't understand what it meant, right? And it wasn't until I started teaching this class and I had to review all this material and I really had to dig into it a lot more and try to understand it better so that I could explain it to students, that I suddenly, it was like the light bulb went off. It only took like 30 years, but the light bulb finally went off. And I was like, oh, I get it now. So, here's my scenario, right? I have a meeting, I'm in Greyhound Arena, I have a meeting over the road with my department down in the Ag building, and I'm running late, okay? So I walk as quickly as I can, I skip up the stairs onto the bridge, I get to the top of the stairs, and that's taken me maybe 2.5 minutes. So I'm working anaerobically, right? I get to the top of the stairs and I'm like, and I used to, when I was younger, I said, I don't understand, why am I out of breath? I know that was anaerobic work, right? I was smart enough to work that out, right? It's only been 2.5 minutes. I know I'm working anaerobically. How come I'm out of puff? This is why, right? So if I'm working anaerobically and I stop before I start working aerobically, then my epoch block just shifts to the end of my anaerobic work. If the anaerobic work was quite high intensity, like running up the stairs, which, you know, when you're out of shape is high intensity, run up the stairs, then my epoch is quite large to accommodate that. I didn't do anything, I just ran up the flight of stairs. Right? Like I said, it only took 30 years for the light bulb to go off. Hopefully, if I explain it like that to you guys, it doesn't take you quite that long. Okay? All right. So, one of the things we need to be able to do, particularly if we are doing intervals or anaerobic bouts, like we're basketball players or we're football players, to some extent, soccer's a bit of an odd sport because they very rarely actually stand still. So it's a little bit trickier to train for soccer than it is for football from an energy system point of view. Particularly then if we're doing a sport event that has anaerobic bouts in it, or we're doing interval training, or we're doing HIIT type training, you know, we're sprinting up the hill and we're walking down the hill, and then we're sprinting up the hill and we're walking down, or up and down the bleachers, right? What we want to be able to do is maximize that walking phase, the recovery phase, so that we're ready to go as hard as we can on the next sprint phase, right? And the research around recovery, maximizing recovery, is quite interesting, because what they see is it kind of depends what you're recovering to do again. All right? So if I do an active recovery, So if I'm doing intervals and my recovery phase is walking in between sprint phases, for example, right, that would be active recovery, okay? Then that is shown to decrease the blood lactate that built up during the sprint phase much more quickly than just standing still, right? So if I can get that blood lactate and I can get the lactate out of the muscles more quickly, the next sprint phase will be more effective because I'll be able to go a bit harder, right? I won't have that hydrogen ion slowing down my ATP production, okay? So if what I want is to work really hard on the sprint phase, then that recovery phase needs to be active. So depending, I guess, on how fit you are or how strong you are, I'm not sure, I don't train, I don't do sprint training, I would not do sprint training, and I've never trained anybody in that. But you know, maybe you sprint and then you jog, and then you sprint and then you jog, right? Or you sprint and walk. Don't sprint and stop and then sprint, because the second sprint you won't have as much power as you did in the first one, right? So during recovery, the lactate cycle, the Cori cycle, they believe is helping there, that the lactate is getting recycled into possibly glucose for use for energy. And we don't do the Cori cycle in the undergrad class, so don't worry about it. You might want to know it's there because it's very interesting, but we're not going to cover it in this class. Okay. So if we're doing these kind of sprint recovery, then the recovery has to be at a low enough intensity. It's got to be below that lactate threshold so that we can get the lactate and the hydrogens out of the way and be ready for the next one. Now, if we do a passive type recovery, then we get higher muscle glycogen levels. So they think that the lactate is getting used to resynthesize glycogen instead of being used for active recovery. So it depends what the goal of the recovery phase is. Right? It's starting to get a bit technical. And this is the point where you want to really appreciate LV. If you're an athlete and you're working with LV, appreciate how brilliant he is. Right? Because to be a really good strength and conditioning coach, you have to play with all these pieces of the puzzle and put them all together in an appropriate program for the person that you're working with. It's very difficult, it's highly scientific, all right? And you want to just step back and go, wow, he's really good at this. Okay? So there doesn't seem to be any difference in how we recover, whether we're trained or untrained. Although people who are fitter might recover a little bit more quickly, particularly after some resistance training. Again, that's the research isn't completely clear on that, and I would expect that that's something that will change, that you'll understand much more over the next few years if you keep on with the research. All right. We've got that. Oh, if you look at page 68, if you're a real visual learner, there's a very nice figure there that gives you all the things that are going on during EPOC in a visual. So if that's beneficial, it's right there at the bottom of the page that the epoch graph is on. And this is just, again, a little bit of research that indicates some of that idea about recovery. If you look at plasma lactate, so that's blood lactate levels, and here's recovery time. If you do a passive recovery, then blood lactate takes much longer to come back down to normal. If you do an active recovery, then it drops a little bit faster. So that might be something to take into account if you're training more than once a day, for example, right? And you need that time in between training 1 and training 2 to get your recovery as good as possible so that you can hit training 2 as hard as you can. Right? Because the only reason we train is to get fitter, stronger, better at something. So I need to be at the best I can be to train, right? If I'm going into training fatigued and tired and my legs feel like lead, I'm not going to have a very good training session. Okay? And that, my friends, is that. Do not worry when you are reviewing Chapter 3. Do not worry about measuring energy production. Not that it's not interesting, not that it's not very useful information, but it will not be on the exam. There's only so much stuff we can cover. So something had to go. And how we measure energy production. Since we can't do it in an applied situation, it takes a lab scenario. To me, it's not as important, right? Because we're not going to go and be in a lab. That's not kind of the people that we are. Unless you're one of the biology students, in which case I apologize immensely and look at the calorimetry stuff. Questions? Friday we will do review of Chapter 13, Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. So start taking a look at those, get your questions written down so that you can come to the review session and ask any questions that you want me to try to clear up for you. We'll work on some of the questions at the ends of the chapters to help you study. Okay, have a good afternoon. I have office hours in 25 minutes. If you've got questions about anything, you can always come to office hours. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow for lab.